にしか会えないのかしら。あなたは私にとって遅すぎて。
僕にとってあなたは突然すぎたんだ。人同士ってこんなものなんだよな。
I love Newtypes, Gundam's new agey space psychic concept, but I think that makes me in the minority in Gundam fandom. When I first got into this series, it was described to me as one of the harder parts of the original show to appreciate, and people often layered praise on its OAVs for their smaller scope and lack of Newtypes. Which I totally get. Gundam is on one level significant as one of the first mecha series that made an attempt to ground its mythology in some kind of realism, so it's jarring for people when it also introduces these occult aspects. But in this video essay, I want to make a case for Newtypes as being one of the most interesting parts of the franchise, and vital to what I think the original text is trying to get across. But first, a note on what Newtypes actually are. Over the course of the various original Gundam timeline works, we see all sorts of powers that are labelled under the term Newtype, but the series makes sure never to explicitly lay out the full scope or rules of these powers. Newtypes have some level of precognition, they often see visions or sense the depth or intent of others. And above all, Newtypes are empaths, deeply emotional pilots who intuitively feel the motives of others. But unlike potentially similar archetypes in sci-fi series, say Force users in Star Wars or the Bene Gesserit in Dune, Newtypes are very hard to define, and that's kind of by design. Part of that is that it doesn't really refer to one thing. There's the Newtype ideology proposed by Zeon Zum Daikun, essentially a kind of space Hegel. That was a proposition that by living in space, a new type of humanity would begin to emerge that would understand one another without preconceptions. But then there's what Newtype is usually used to describe, mobile suit pilots who seem to exhibit paranormal powers. This is already kind of an unusual bit of world building. The term we use to describe these characters wasn't invented after their emergence. It was a pre-existing piece of ideology that the characters in that world saw as a precursor to this development, and then used to describe something they saw manifesting on the battlefield. Gundam likes to be complicated, y'all. Personally, I really love the visuals that Newtypes allow the original series and movies to explore. The show is structured in a way where, for the first half, its style is fairly dry and realistic, but as Amuro's Newtype abilities awaken, the form of the series veers into psychedelia, and this is used to let us into Amuro's internal emotional world. All of this culminates in a moment in which Amuro basically fulfills the initial concept of Newtypism, of understanding another human being, but with an ironic twist. Right before dealing a death blow against an enemy pilot, Lala, the two merge their minds and instantly fall in love. What follows is one of the best moments in the whole franchise, an evocative scene of transcendental union and far-out imagery. And this is kind of part of an arc in Tomino's career, from the late 70s until the mid-80s, where he would often end his shows in these explosions of imagery. His second Ideon movie is almost an art film at its end, with even multimedia aspects like live action. Personally, I'm much less into how Newtypes are used as the franchise goes on, but I think there's a reason for that. It's very difficult to build on 0079's ending. If we imagine that there was never a sequel to that first series, that Gundam never became popular in reruns, and the story ended there, then its ending would have a very different quality. The human race has seen the worst war in its history. New grievances and factions have emerged, but in this war, we've also seen two humans connect fully and completely. And it seems like all the younger cast are now emerging as Newtypes themselves. With no sequels, we might assume that there will be a Newtype revolution after this point, with Zeon Zum Daikun's prophecy coming to pass. That's not how it panned out, obviously, and in later series Newtypes seem to represent a loss of possibility, a revolutionary wave that didn't manifest or was consolidated into the military, but that's with the benefit of hindsight. At the same time, a certain level of cynicism about Newtypes is built into the original story. The difficulty of defining a new type is a major theme in the novelizations of the original Gundam, written by creator Yoshiyuki Tomino. Especially as they go on, those novels become really interested with the question of how different groups interpret Daikun's philosophy. And not every character views them as saviors. Hayato, at one point, wonders if new types would truly represent a, quote, total transformation of mankind, or if they would simply be a, quote, group of murderous supermen, even super butchers. Later on, Amuro casts doubt on the idea that his abilities are in any way moving him toward a transcendence of human failings. He says at one point, "As my abilities increase, I wish I could also become a better person, but it's not happening, and that frightens me." In the same monologue, he says, "I'd love to attempt a total psychic breakthrough to achieve total harmony with others. If universal harmony with all mankind, regardless of background or station in life, were really possible, I'd feel ecstatic. But right now, I'm having trouble just harmonizing with myself." There's actually a vein of paranoia around this stuff, particularly in the third novel. There are these really interesting conversations where the characters start to voice anxieties around what's going to happen when they win the war, wondering how Newtypes will be perceived in that period. Amuro says, "I can imagine a scenario where we succeed in destroying Garen, and then people start asking, why? Why out of all the Federation forces was the Pegasus 2 able to do it? The answer, of course, that we're Newtypes, a bunch of paranormal espers, a bunch of professional killers. They'd start to even question whether Newtypes and normal people can coexist. They'd say we dominate normal people and threaten everything they value. Forget about being promoted, we should worry about surviving." At the same time, we also see Newtypism used to justify fascist atrocity. Leader of Zeon, Garen Zabi, says that any talk about too many people having been killed thus far in the war is utter nonsense. The bureaucrats on Earth running the Federation's stupid system aren't helping us prepare for a Newtype age, they're just getting in the way. I think Newtypism being an ideology that is interpreted differently by the characters is really significant. In terms of sci-fi, I think Gundam is kind of uniquely interested in ideology as the primary way its conflicts are articulated. Anthropologist Hiroki Azuma famously argued that Gundam, and other 80s otaku sci-fi franchises, fulfilled the role of substituting for political ideology and grand narratives at a time when they were in decline in the real world, when our understanding of culture, political units, and identity signifiers were atomizing. For him, Gundam kind of comes at the midpoint of this process. He argues that the postmodern period begins in Japan with the Empire's surrender in World War II, but it really starts to accelerate in the mid-90s, when shows like Evangelion outright reject a grand narrative model, with more focus in fandom on karamoe and unstable realities. But Gundam comes at a time when people are still holding on to these concepts, and want to fulfill that desire for ideology. And I know Azuma's theories are something people are kind of sick of hearing about on AniTube, but there is something here that I think hasn't been noted much. In the same section, Azuma points out that during the 1960s and 1970s, that hunger for ideology also manifested in a resurgent interest in, quote, occult thought and New Age science. And that's what Newtypism is. It's totally in tune with the aesthetics and language of the New Age movements of that period. Fun thing to note on this, the music that plays during Lala and Amuro's awakening in the movies, it's incredibly close to the track Lizard by the psychedelic band King Crimson.
Farewell, the temple master's bells, his kiosk and his black worm seed, courtship solely of his word, with Eden guaranteed. For now, Prince Rupert's tears are.
Key to Azuma's conception of postmodernity is the idea that transcendence, something usually fulfilled by religion or philosophy, is in decline. And what are Newtypes if not a way for transcendental imagery to reassert itself in a sci-fi framework? Also, the idea of a mass transcendental awakening that could revolutionize society, but is also in danger of being co-opted by government structures, that is such a juicy parallel to the optimism of the counterculture movements at the time, and the way they were in threat of being co-opted by military and government structures. It's also, I think, one of the reasons Newtypes feel so jarring today, because they're so aesthetically and thematically grounded in a 1970s counterculture we now feel very dislocated from. Or at the very least don't expect in like a military sci-fi spectacle. In later Gundam works, Newtypes do seem to become co-opted. In Zeta Gundam, we see the rise of artificial Newtypes, created as pilots by the Federation. These pilots are emotionally volatile, even more so than regular Newtypes, and require special medication. They're pretty parallel to the psychics in Ketsuro Otomo's Akira. And whereas the original series ends on a note of potential hope and optimism, its sequel Zeta ends with the main character psychically regressed. And that series' sequel, Double Zeta, ends with the main character Judo cursing the structures of the Federation government and basically like packing up his shit and going to Jupiter. It doesn't seem like the Newtype revolution has come to pass by this point. But what makes Newtype so interesting is that we still can't write them off entirely, because there are these moments of transcendence that do suggest that some kind of possibilities are being unlocked. In the novels, for instance, it's the resulting psychic shockwave from Amuro's death that convinces Char and the main characters to join forces and defeat Giran Zabi. And I love how Tomino writes this scene, because after all this dialogue casting doubt on the possibility of revolution, in an instant, the characters feel that it is possible. In a segment from Kai's perspective, he curses Amuro for dying, but Tomino writes, he continued raging, but he knew that the things Amuro and the other MS pilots had speculated about were more than a dream. The world they knew was changing. Intuitively, Kai knew that he was linked by a new consciousness with Char. The universe, which for the last few seconds seemed to have frozen, was about to change. At the same time, even this is short-lived. Over the next few pages, they succeed and liberate Zeon from the Zabis. But as Char gives a speech to the Zeon people, Tomino writes from Kai's perspective, Amuro, he thought, this is the way it turned out. Suddenly, he realized he hated Char. The revolutionary moment has been seized, but Kai shows some regret here when the dust begins to settle. That scene with Char, by the way, brings us to the other work I really like when it comes to Newtype, Char's Counterattack. What I love about that movie, what I think makes it genuinely kind of radical even today, is how human it makes these characters. Both Amuro, who obviously survived in the anime version, and Char are so flawed in this movie and like so terrible at communicating. And the whole thing is really about these questions. Can Newtypes save humanity, or are they a justification for war? And more broadly, because that's what this is a metaphor for, what is the cost of revolutionary action? Like, take this one scene that I think is kind of at the heart of the movie. So, you might remember this, Char and Amuro have this ideological shouting match while having a duel with bazookas, which, by the way, is like the most Gundam thing ever. This movie is such a torrent of action that I kind of missed what their argument was about the first time I watched it, but I think it's really relevant to these themes.
革命はいつもインテリが始めるが、夢みたいな目標を持ってやるから、いつも過激なことしかやらない。
四方から電波が来る。
しかし革命の後では、気高い革命の心だって官僚主義と大衆に飲み込まれていくから、インテリはそれを嫌って世間からも政治からも身を引いて世捨て人になる。だったら
私は世直しなど考えていない。
Amuro is basically saying here that he's lost faith in revolutions. Char, on the other hand, sees Amuro as just a tool to be used by Federation structures.
されているものが言うことか。
The end of the movie is great because it's these two Newtypes, Char and Amuro, having a really revealing conversation, but totally failing to understand one another.
いいんじゃない。クエスの父親がありなどできない。だからか、貴様はクエスをマシンとして扱って。
そうか、クエスは父親を求めていたのか。それでそれを私は迷惑に感じてクエスをマシンにしたんだな。
貴様ほどの男がなんて器量の小さい。
ララースンは私の母になってくれるかもしれなかった女性だ。そのララを殺したお前に言えたことか。
お母さん、ララが。うわっ。
Char's final line reveals that he's driven by this Freudian impulse. And then there's another kind of psychedelic miracle, and the movie just ends, and we have to chew on what we've seen. After this point, I think it's fair to say that Tomino moves away from Newtypes as a concept. Once we get to Turn A, probably his best series by the way, they don't appear at all. Part of that, I think, is the general move away from psychedelic imagery in his work. But I also think it might have been part of a concern about the way Newtypes had been misinterpreted by fans, who saw the plot point as basically just a really cool power-up for the main characters. Co-creator of Gundam, and really good creator in his own right, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, has actually brought this up in interviews. There's a conversation between him and Makoto Shinkai. Yasuhiko's talks about how he felt the original Gundam had been misinterpreted, stating, "One of the biggest misunderstandings was this reading that old types are a no-good bunch who need to be supplanted by a new type generation adapted to the space age. That was the Cult's view too. The Gundam story isn't about that. It's a story through and through about desperation. People can't change, they can't understand one another. They can't, but how great would it be if they could?" This is something that I think is really key to the Gundam novels, a lot of recent takes on the series miss. There is this possibility of expanded consciousness, but that can easily be warped to fit different ideological models. It's summed up really succinctly in the third book, in a chapter from Amuro's point of view. Quote, "He had long ago realized that having a special gift did not guarantee a superior or moral character, although people tended to excuse nearly every action of someone they deemed gifted." There's an interesting tension here. Newtypes are a fictional grand narrative that acts as a metaphor for the possibilities and potential failures of political movements, at a time when, in the real world, grand narratives were fading. I think Azuma is right when he says Gundam is an archetypical grand narrative story, a piece of fiction that allows the viewer to engage in its world by memorizing lore and fictional histories. But it's also worth remembering that Newtypes are specifically designed to be difficult or impossible to fully define. They actively resist this grand narrative model. Not to get too English degree here, but I actually think Newtype ideology being multiple things to multiple people, being a dialectic, that's kind of the key theme of the Gundam novels in particular. I think it's even built into its final lines, which take place after the war has ended, with Sailor Mass swimming on Earth. Tamino writes, "Amuro was gone, but he was with her. She began swimming long strokes, alone." And that's the final line. This emphasis on her being alone, and not, to me feels like a final statement on Newtypes as a whole. They're a revolutionary possibility and a justification for war. Mutated ace pilots and empathetic espers. True and false.
It's too late for lectures. Someone has to shoulder all the evils of humanity. And I believe in the rebirth of a humanity that has come to live here in space.
Revolutions are dreamt up by intellectuals, but their aims are so unrealistic, they'll stoop to drastic measures. Following the revolution, the worthy passions for rebirth are swallowed up by bureaucracy and mediocrity.
I'm not planning to bring new life into the world.
I thought you were more broad-minded. She was just confused.
Lala Soon was a young woman who may very well have become a mother to me. You took away her life, so don't you dare judge me!
Mother?